If you've been anywhere on the internet looking up stuff on fantasy, then you've most certainly come across the name Brandon Sanderson. He is without a doubt one of the biggest names in the fantasy genre right now. And his two most popular book series are the Stormlight Archive and Mistborn. So, going into this book, I was pretty hyped to say the least. I mean, one of the most popular book series written by one of the most popular fantasy authors right now. I mean, it must be amazing, right? Well, I finished this, which is the first book in the Mistborn series, a while ago, and I've just been sitting on this review because honestly, I found it to be a little disappointing. Now, don't get me wrong, I mean, it's not a bad book, it's definitely a good book, honestly, a really good book, but when my expectations were as high as they were, it's really hard not to feel a little disappointed after reading this. So while this is a review of the first book in the Mistborn series, it's also a cautionary tale in Overhype and how getting overhyped can, to an extent, decrease your enjoyment in something you would have otherwise loved. I'll give a broad overview of the story, then follow up with my review from a non-spoiler perspective, then I'll get into some spoilers. I'll be sure to mark the video with timestamps so you can easily skip between the sections, and so that way you can avoid spoilers as well. The first book in the Mistborn series is, contrary to popular belief, not titled Mistborn, like it is right here. The title of this book is actually The Final Empire. This book follows a group of thieves who are allomancers, or people that are able to use magic. Kelsier is the leader of this group and is Mistborn, or a person who can use all the magical elements. This is in contrast to a Misting, which is an allomancer that can only use a single magical element. The known magical elements are activated by ingesting and burning the applicable metal. Burning iron means you can pull nearby metals. Burning steel means you can push nearby metals. Burning tin enhances your senses. Burning pewter enhances your physical strength. Burning brass smooths people's emotions. Burning zinc riots people's emotions. Burning bronze shows who is using allomancy nearby. And burning copper hides allomancy, so someone using bronze cannot see if magic is being used. Vin, the newest recruit to the group, is also a Mistborn. She is one of the main characters in this book, along with Kelsier. Kelsier is planning one of the largest heists ever done, a heist against the Lord Ruler himself. The Lord Ruler, being pretty evident by his title, is the supreme leader of the world. Kelsier later admits to his real goal, though, which is to overthrow the Lord Ruler. The Lord Ruler is human, who is, as far as everyone knows, immortal, since he's ruled over the world for over 1,000 years. The Lord Ruler has separated citizens into two main classes. There are the Ska, which are essentially slaves, and these are people who were descendants of people that rebelled against the Lord Ruler when he became the supreme leader, and then descendants of people who assisted, or at least did not rebel against the Lord Ruler, are now the nobility. Vin, being the newest member to Kelsier's group, is not aware she's a Mistborn, but she ends up training with Kelsier's team, who is comprised of Mistings, and through this training, Vin is able to master all of the magical elements. Vin's other main goal is to infiltrate the nobility and spy on them by posing as a noble herself and attending balls, which is something the noble houses put on every week. She is able to do this and learns of ways to destabilize them and cause a war between the different noble houses. Kelsier hopes to conquer the city through this house war and then invade the city with his Ska army that he has been secretly recruiting. Now, I won't get into any specific spoilers here, but I will say that the climax of this book is this invasion and the attempt to overthrow the Lord Ruler. And although this is the first book in a trilogy, the closure you get in this book is more or less neatly tied up in the end. So like I said at the beginning of this video, this is a good book. I mean, honestly, a very good book. The characters, the story, the setting, the world building are all really great. The writing style is very basic, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean it more as this book is very easy to pick up and read. The vocabulary in the prose is very basic in nature, which is nice since that means anyone can pick up this book and enjoy it. That also means it's very easy to lose track of time. I haven't had a book that really enveloped me like this book did for a long time. I mean, there were times when I was reading this and just got so engrossed in the story that I didn't realize how much time had passed. So the writing style makes it very easy to get into and to keep you engaged pretty much throughout. I wouldn't say the whole way through though, because there were some boring parts to the story, especially around the middle to 2/3 of the way through. But overall, there is enough going on in the story and with the characters that you won't ever really lose interest. I hate using the term page turner, but I mean, this book really is a page turner. The overall story is engaging, but certainly nothing to write home about. You very much have tropes that are typical for the fantasy genre, such as an evil lord the main characters are trying to overthrow, a group of characters who are unlikely to succeed but push forward anyway, a main character who is gifted but doesn't realize it until later on in the story, essentially filling the chosen one role, and an unlikely love interest, which is not surprising at all. You can see this coming from a mile away. Although the book has a fair amount of tropes in it, the book is so well written that they didn't bother me. The characters in particular are very well fleshed out and are the real highlight of this book. That being said, I wouldn't say any of these characters are unique, but they are definitely interesting. They all have their own separate motivations for doing what they are doing, and seeing how these characters change and grow throughout the book is really great. Especially seeing how they tackle different obstacles they come to face is what really kept me engaged throughout this book. First of all, you have Vin, the main character of this book, or at least one of the main characters. She is essentially filling the chosen one role, the trope of the story. I really like how she is put in uncomfortable situations, being put in as a noble, and seeing how she adapts to those situations and changes because of them. Really was fascinating. Kelsier is the other main character. He's hell-bent on revenge, which is what gives him his motivation throughout the story. Unlike Vin, he doesn't really change throughout the story, but you do get a better understanding of what drives him since you slowly get to know his backstory and what he went through. Learning more about his character is what I thought was interesting about him. Then you have a bunch of secondary characters who are not nearly as fleshed out as Vin and Kelsier are, but they still play an important role in the story and are pretty interesting in their own right. Sazed in particular is a character I really liked, but was not in the book nearly enough in my opinion. I would have loved to get to know him and some of the other secondary characters as well, but understandably so, the details are kept to a minimum, otherwise this book would have been, absolutely massive. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I honestly enjoy really long books, but I can see why Sanderson would want to keep the book, kind of trimmed down on those details. The setting that Sanderson has created is also top tier stuff. Again, not wholly unique, but well written just like the rest of the book, and definitely interesting to keep your attention. You have a world where ash is constantly falling from the sky, plants everywhere are dead, and supernatural mists cloak the world every night. 1,000 years ago, a prophesized hero ascended to godhood to repel the deepness, which was a terror threatening the world, but whose true nature has been lost in time. With the deepness repelled and mankind saved, the world changed into its current state by the hero, who took on the title of Lord Ruler and has since ruled for 1,000 years as the immortal tyrant and god. I mean, come on, right? That sounds pretty awesome. So the setting, the characters, the overall story are all well written and fleshed out and engaging. One thing I always encounter in other books is the story or the setting of the characters are engaging, but the author goes too in-depth into those aspects, and then they start to lose some of their appeal. Not so in this book. You get just enough details to get you invested without it becoming too much. One thing worth mentioning, and this might be a little controversial, is this book comes off as YA, young adult to me. And yes, I know that isn't really a genre, but more of a marketing term, but I would probably place this book more in line with other YA books I have read than other adult fantasy books. I know it's not supposed to be YA, at least that was not the intent of the author, I think, and maybe it's just due to Sanderson's prose, but even more than that, the story seems to follow a very basic YA type of structure. And depending on your stance, this might be a good thing or a bad thing. For me personally, it was more of a negative at first since I was not expecting that. But after getting into the book more and more, I don't think it was really a negative. But definitely something to keep in mind. I don't want to make it sound like this is a kid's book though. I mean, there's fighting, there's death. None of it's grotesque in nature or obscene, but it's still there. And there's not anything really sex related in the book either. The most interesting thing about this book is the magic system it plays. And I know this is something that Sanderson has always excelled in. The way magic systems work and the aspect it plays in the overall story is incredibly well done. Magic follows some basic rules that cannot be broken no matter who the character is. They all have to follow these basic rules of the magic system. A lot of time in fantasy books, you have magic just for the sake of there being magic in it, with no explanations on how it works or why, but definitely not in this book. It certainly doesn't dive deep into the inner workings of magic, but you get just enough information on the systems in place, and you can see how Sanderson wrote the story following these rules. He does not write around them or break the rules, which I must say is really fresh in comparison to some other books that I've read recently. Okay, so getting into a couple of spoilers, I really like how this book starts off with Kelsier appearing and killing a noble, essentially freeing the Ska that were owned by that family. This opening is great because it starts out as almost a mystery since you don't know who this person is, why they did what they did, and how they did it. It really captures your attention right away, and you want to keep reading to get the answers to those questions. And of course, the first few pages of any book are always the most important. The book then moves to Vin, and we get to see her life and what it's like before being recruited by Kelsier's group. And we learn that her life was, pretty crappy. She was abandoned by her brother, which might be for the best because the guy sounds like he was a total piece of crap. And then the group of people she lives with and works with were constantly abusing her. It isn't until she joins up with Kelsier that she realizes how much better life can be. Sure, life is still, a struggle. I mean, it is for any of the Ska in this world, but at least now it's tolerable for Vin. So right away, you have two interesting characters to follow. Just like with the introduction of this book, this creates a solid first impression and keeps you hooked. When Vin starts posing as a noble and attending the balls the house has put on, she meets with Elend Venture, who is heir to the most powerful house in the city. And right away, I knew there was going to be a romance between the two characters. I'm not sure if Sanderson was trying to make it painfully obvious when they first meet each other, but it is. The romance between them definitely did not surprise me. In fact, not much of anything in this book was really surprising. You can really see most things coming a mile away. Even though there is this romance between Vin and Elend, it is not a focal point of the story at all, and does not go much beyond the characters swooning over each other. So don't go into this book expecting any kind of romance stuff, because you won't get that. Even though most of the things are predictable in this book, there was one thing that I didn't see coming, and that was the introduction of the other magic system. Allomancers are all we know about this world for quite a while until we are introduced to Feruchemy. Unlike allomancy, which burns metal you ingest to gain power, a Feruchemist must provide power for the magic from their own body, storing it over time for use later. So, for example, if you want to be super strong, you need to balance it by being super weak for a period of time. And the fact that the Lord Ruler is able to use both of these magic systems makes total sense for why he is the way he is. We don't get to know why he's able to use both magic systems, since it seems like no one else in the world can, but I really like how Sanderson makes it so all of his characters, even the supreme ones, have a set of rules they need to follow. Also, I must say, I like how the Lord Ruler is perceived as being an evil lord, but at the same time there's a question remaining about whether or not he really is evil, or if he actually saved humanity in the past, fulfilling the Supreme Leader role. Maybe this is addressed in future books, but I always like it when there are shades of gray and the characters are not just black and white. Speaking of characters though, I would have really liked to learn more about Vin's brother. The little bit we know about him is that he would always warn Vin to trust no one, and that he sounds like he was not a very good brother to her. But getting to know more about him and his relationship with her would have been nice. The book seems to kind of tease the reader with those details. I mean, I say either give us something worthwhile or just avoid giving us anything at all. One of the bigger problems I had with this book was when Kelsier's army attacks a pointless outpost and ends up getting destroyed. The motivation behind this act was really lacking in my opinion, and it really didn't make much sense for this to happen. It seems like this was just an excuse to add further tension into the story, and after that event it's far more serious situation about how Kelsier's group is going to take down the city and overthrow the Lord Ruler. It does of course add more tension to the story, but I would have preferred if it was done differently, like maybe if somebody in the army betrayed them. I know I already talked about pacing and how it's pretty solid throughout, but there were some parts in the middle of the book that got to be a little on the boring side. When Vin is constantly going to balls, it just seems like not much is happening. There is of course still a lot of stuff happening in the background, but we're stuck with Vin's point of view for a lot of these parts, which is a shame. If the book focused more on just Vin and Kelsier, that probably would have helped out tremendously. And just one more thing I wanted to mention from a spoiler perspective. The ending with Vin facing the Lord Ruler goes exactly how you would expect it to go. After all, Vin needs to complete her hero's journey. And like I've already mentioned a couple times, this just shows how predictable this book can be. It's not necessarily a problem, but it is worth keeping in mind if you like your stories to be filled with twists and surprises. This book definitely doesn't have that. So most of this is really positive, right? And that is the thing about this book. It is very well written. And it is, without a doubt, a very good fantasy story as well. However, I can't help feeling a little disappointed in it. I went into this book expecting one of the greatest fantasy stories ever written, and that's not something you're going to get from it. And you know, this was probably my fault. I always try to go into books without any expectations. But it's kinda hard to avoid the hype bubble surrounding Brandon Sanderson. I had all these preconceived notions going in that Brandon Sanderson is the next Tolkien, and that his world building and characters and stories are on an entirely next level. And maybe I am disappointed in it because I went into this book expecting something wholly new, something that would really blow my socks off, something that I had never experienced before. And you really don't get that with this book. You get a really good book, but that is it. And there's nothing wrong with this, but at the same time, it's just hard not to feel a little disappointed. I mean, I kept thinking while reading this book that something crazy and unexpected was going to happen, but it never did. The story followed this path that I pretty much knew it was going to follow the entire time. I don't want to make it sound like I'm hating on this book, but there is something so sterile about it. Like Sanderson has mastered the art of creating good, but ultimately typical fantasy stories that appeal to the broadest market available. Think of it like what Marvel has done with creating their MCU. No hate to the MCU, of course. But again, this is more my fault than a fault with the book, though, because I let myself get hyped. I had my expectations as high as they were. Honestly, if I had my expectations in check, or if I did not know anything about Sanderson or Mistborn before going into this book, I would have enjoyed it more than I did. And again, I did like the book. I mean, I liked it quite a bit, but at the same time, it's hard not to feel a little disappointed with it. I know I kind of ended this video on a sour note, but I want to make sure it is clear that I thought this was a good book. I mean, even a very good book. And even though I still feel disappointed in it, I can at least acknowledge the fact that I enjoyed it for what it was. I must say the closure you get is very good in my opinion. Sure, there are still some loose ends that need to be tied up, but even still you can easily read this book and not feel the need to read the other books in the series. I mean, I'm not sure I want to read the sequels either. Let me know if you think that's something I should or should not do. I want to try his Stormlight Archive books next to see if those are as good as people say. I will try, though, not to get too hyped up. Let me know if you have any comments down below. Thanks for watching.